Hello, welcome to another episode of Analog Adventures. My name is Crispin Jeffrey Franco, and I'm the co-founder of Stacks Book Club. Joining me today is author Kay Chronister. Kay is the author of 3 novels, Thin Places, Desert Creatures, and most recently, in tonight's focus of conversation, The Bog Wife. Kay's been nominated for the Shirley Jackson and World Fantasy Awards. She originally hails from Washington State, but has spent time in Virginia, Cambodia, and Arizona, including time earning a PhD in English at the University of Arizona. Go Wildcats. Kay now resides just outside of Philadelphia, just outside Philadelphia. And we're going to be talking about The Bog Wife. Kay, welcome to Analog Adventures. What are you drinking tonight?
Thank you for having me. I have got some maple ginger herbal tea. We're winding down here on the East Coast, so I'm done with caffeine for the day.
Very nice. We've been featuring what we call a frosted cranberry lemonade on our
Ooh.
winter menu. So it felt fitting to break that out one more time as we talk about The Bog Wife here and take that down. So let's talk about The Bog Wife. Introduce us to the novel. What are people in store for who haven't had a chance to pick it up?
This is a gothic family drama about a family with 5 adult siblings who have lived on their ancestral home in a cranberry bog in rural West Virginia for many generations. And for those many generations, they have had an agreement with the bog where it produces a wife for the eldest son. When this novel starts out, that agreement has been broken. There is no wife for the son for this generation. And so the family hits a kind of crisis of what do we do next? Where do we go? What's happening? What does the bog want?
Okay, where do you come up with the idea of a bog that produces a wife? Like, where does that come from, and why Appalachia? I guess because listening to where you've lived, I didn't hear that in the bio, but maybe the Virginia part of that has a connection there. What made you want to set a novel in West Virginia, and where did this idea for the bog wife come from?
I was thinking about a lot of the kind of folklore traditional stories about women and particularly wives being created out of different kinds of inanimate objects, and kind of being this like magical, like part human, part not present. So like Selkie stories. There's a Welsh folk tale, of a woman made from flowers. And so I was kind of thinking about those stories, but the actual idea of the bog kind of bringing forth a wife is, as far as I know, not from any folklore. That's an invention of mine. And this novel ended up in Appalachia for a couple of reasons, because I did consider some other settings. I knew I wanted to write about, I was really interested in writing about a wetland setting. That came before the concept of the wife actually coming out of it. And I knew I wanted the family to be connected to it in some way. But I came to West Virginia because I wanted a place in the United States with um, a relatively recent history of settler colonialism compared to a lot of the rest of the East Coast. West Virginia fits that bill. And I wanted a place that had a bog like this, where the climate was kind of right. And so the conjunction of those two things, which when you read the novel, you'll kind of see why they are both important, had me land on West Virginia eventually.
That's awesome. Yeah, the setting and the setting and the tone that the setting creates, I think, leads so much to the atmosphere of the novel. I also wonder, being in Appalachia, so I have this like thing where I'm constantly thinking about how do authors craft stories, and like where does technology fit into that? And so like in this novel, because of the remoteness of the setting and where the Hasley family lives, it's very easy to sort of take the technology out of their hands, and you get these like beautiful conversations between people. What's it like as an author writing stories in a modern day where like, was it intentional to put them in a situation where technology couldn't be used as a crutch for communication and like to kind of force conversation? Or how do you manage that as an author in a world where we don't talk to people very often?
I love that question because that is something I definitely think about. I'm always trying to escape kind of the facts of contemporary technology. Like, I'm very much not interested in writing a story where people are doing a lot of their communication through phones, even though that's like realistically, what life is like. And so I feel like I'm always coming up with these contrived ways to kind of get people away from technology without actually committing to like writing historical fiction, which I always consider and don't do. So in this case, like, I mean, it's really just as simple as like they're in the middle of nowhere. So we don't have like reception so much, but maybe more importantly, they're really, for the most part, not interested in talking to anyone outside their own household. And so it was part of the kind of like hyper isolation of these people and the kind of like claustrophobic feeling of the novel that they wouldn't be communicating a lot with the outside world. And so it worked really well to have them in their own kind of little insular world where they're only talking to each other.
Yeah, I thought it worked. I thought it worked really well. Yeah, I'm always now like on the lookout for like, how is the author going to incorporate that modern technology, or how do they create a situation where the technology doesn't, like, it rightfully doesn't exist. And so I thought this was a great way to set characters in a modern timeline, but also, leave them to have to communicate with their family. So let's talk about the family, because this book as much about family as it is about anything else, I think. So we have the Hadsleys, who, as far as the family knows, has gone back till the founding of the area, having lived on this bog, generation after generation, being, like you said at the beginning, being sort of built upon this compact with the bog, and the patriarch of the families succumbing to the bog and producing the new matriarch to be kind of carry the family line forward. But it's really a story about five siblings, who I felt were so clearly distinct from each other. And I think that they also felt very real, because I could feel some of the expectations of like where you land in the family line really coming through from the characters. So we have Charlie, who is the eldest child and the heir to the Hadsley patriarch role, who definitely feels like he's shouldering a lot of the burden of what that means and trying to grapple with what that feels like. Then we have, where's my list here? We have Etta is the next in line, and I feel like throughout the story we really start to see the caretakerness, and I feel like first daughters especially sort of carry more of the caretaking weight with their family. There's some reasons that you get into the book that you start to understand why Etta might be shouldering even more of those caretaking responsibilities. Then we have Wenna, the middle child, who's just like me, a middle. Um, and Wenna is the only member of the family to have ever left the bog, and she finds her way back really early in the book. And then sort of, I feel, has like a really interesting, it's really interesting to see one of the characters have an outside perspective on what life outside of the family compound looks like. Percy, the second son, has a whole bunch of stuff going on without spoiling what's going on, but Percy is definitely the second son, and then Nora, the youngest, who I feel like throughout the book, really her main focus is just how do we keep the whole family together, and I feel like that also resonates with the youngest child kind of archetype. What was it like crafting five different POV characters, and why did you choose to go five POV characters versus like an overarching narrator approach?
That was the greatest challenge of writing this book, and it was also the most fun. I played around with how many perspectives I wanted to include. I think I always knew I wanted multiple, but it took me a while to settle on like it's going to be all of the siblings, and who the siblings were and how they would relate to each other took a while to come together too. But I felt like it was really important for the kind of story I wanted to tell that they all had their perspectives there because a lot of the novel and a lot of the fun and challenge of writing the novel is like how different their perceptions of each other and of the things that happen in the book are without like no one's like a totally like unreliable narrator who's making stuff up, but they all have really, really different like filters they're experiencing things through. And I think that's like as someone who grew up, like I'm the oldest of four, like that's so true about growing up with siblings that like you all remember things really differently and have really different perspectives on the same events in your childhood. And sometimes that causes a lot of tension and a lot of pain, like even much later. And so I wanted to play around with that when I was writing these siblings.
Yeah, the tension definitely comes across. And yeah, I think the resonance of, because there is enough of an age gap between the characters, their perspective on the same events are just inherently always going to be different, because their lived experience is so much different. I think that comes across really well. I just love the voice of each of the characters. So job well done in
Thank
crafting
you.
5 very unique voices there. So as the book progresses, the tension between the siblings rises, the tension between the family and the land gets cranked up. Um, I've seen this book described as eco horror. I've seen it described as speculative fiction. What do you consider this book to be? Like, how would you classify it if you feel like it needs to be classified?
It's always so hard for me to figure out where I fit with genre. I'm not sure I would really describe this novel as a horror novel at all, even though I think that's like usually where it's shelved in like in terms of the kind of big bookstore categories, probably that makes the most sense. But to me, I think I feel like I felt very much like I was coming out of the Gothic tradition, which is kind of it's kind of part of horror, but it's kind of its own thing too. And I definitely also owe a lot of debts to weird fiction, which is another kind of like hanging out with horror, but not quite horror subgenre. So I think those two, the gothic and the weird, are the words I would use to describe it. But I really like to play with different genres and kind of exist between genre. So I think there's a lot of terms that you could use.
Yeah, I love that you said weird fiction because the person that this book made me think of was Jeff Vandermeer
Mm.
and the Annihilation series. I would that one might be like a little bit more like sci-fi horror than this one is for sure, but like still that the idea of like the environment being an active character in the story and sort of the tension between like yeah, is there magical realism or is there not magical realism? I think Jeff plays a lot with that line too. And you sort of, as the characters are discovering more about the situation, then you, the reader, start to get more information. I think he's definitely more sci-fi. We shelve this in just regular, like in our fiction section, because yeah, to your point, like I said, I've seen it been called eco horror or gothic horror. If you're looking for jump scares or anything like that, I would say this isn't that book. This is much more. This is like literature to me. It's the writing, it's the prose, it's the conversation, it's the dialogue with this super creepy atmospheric setting that feels very real. Um, yeah, so I don't know if Jeff Vandermeer resonates at all for you, but that's who I thought of.
Oh, definitely. I love Jeff Vandermeer. I love the whole Annihilation trilogy. So definitely a great comparison to hear and definitely someone who's influenced me a lot as a writer.
Awesome. Well, glad to hear that. So Kay, what's next for you? What's the next project? Where are we going with you next?
So I am in very early stages of my next long fiction project. And I don't want to say too much about it yet, but I'll say a couple things, which is that I'm thinking about farm animals and farming and animal husbandry a lot, and I'm thinking about mother-daughter relationships a lot with this next book.
Cool. Well, you got me hooked. I'm interested. We are going to take a quick break. If you have not read The Bog Wife, now is a good time to stop this podcast, go out to your local independent bookstore, grab a copy, read it, and then come back because we're going to get into the spoilery part of the conversation. So we'll just take a quick pause and we'll be right back full of spoilers. Now, this is your last warning. Pause this one, come back after you've read The Bog Wife. All right, we are back, Kay. Let's get into it. We have only folks that have read the book with us now, so I really want to really dig in because this book was a mind trip. I think that was probably what you were intending for. Um, the entire way through the book, I felt like I was struggling with: is this a cult, or is the compact real, or is it something like is it both of those things? And so like as you started to like pull away parts of the family legend and lore and you know Charlie starts to figure stuff out and Wenna has her perspective and everyone starts to kind of piece together that dad Charlie was lying and we start to get deeper into the story. Like at what point did you always know the bog was going to actually be alive and how did you sort of like put those two things together?
I really went back and forth a lot, to be honest. I kind of like changed my mind about what I wanted the reality of the world of the novel to be like a bunch of times, honestly, and it involved some rewriting. I think for me, the option of like absolutely none of this was real at all. This is just what they think, and there's nothing kind of weird or magical going on here. That was like never really on the table because that's just not sort of where I tend to go as a writer. I knew there had to be something kind of weird, but how much of their family's history was made up and what the actual origin story was, that was a big question mark for me for a lot of the book. And having the Bog Wife appear at the end and be alive and be their mother and still obviously be very much like a plant woman. That was actually like a fairly late in the game decision. That was not originally how I saw the story going.
Yeah, I think if right, I think if there wasn't a bog wife, then I think the story becomes a lot darker. Actually, like if the story is only that, generation after generation of, of patriarch of the family has basically kept this lie and cloistered the family, and then you have to wonder, where did the bog wife come from? Like, who was actually birthing all of these children? Like, that's a
Mhm.
much darker story than
Definitely.
the one that you penned. So I did appreciate that there was some magical element to the story. I liked that it went that direction as opposed to, but yeah, I like the way that you pitted those things together and kind of married both ideas. Like, there definitely was some shadiness going on, but I think it's up to us as the reader to decide, was every generation knowingly, misleading the next generation, or was it actual ignorance at some point? And I guess we'll never actually know that. You don't have to answer that if you don't want to, but that would be an unanswerable question. So when we're actually going to be discussing this book in the store, I think the discussion may have happened by the time this episode actually runs. But one of the sections we do is unanswerable questions, and normally we don't have the author available to answer those unanswerable questions. But that would be my number one overarching question. Like, did they all know that it was like kind of real, kind of not, or was this the first generation that sort of figured out the truth?
I will say I do like to leave things kind of open-ended, but in my head, from my perspective, I don't know about like all the prior generations, but definitely in my imagination, their father did not know the truth of the family's origins. He's as oblivious as they are at the
That's
beginning.
that's how I read it too. He felt like too much of a true believer to have been lying that well about it. So yeah, that was my impression too. Was, yeah, Charles the dad definitely was a true believer, which made me think that maybe this was the first generation that had sort of cracked the code.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a conversation between Michael and Wenna, uh, where he says to her, um, that she fears anything that's sacred, and she responds with, how is it sacred if you're not afraid of it? What is your connection to this idea? Is this, like, do you take this from something? Is there like a connection that we're supposed to pull between fear and faith?
I thought a lot about like religious belief with this book. Um because like you mentioned earlier, in some ways this family kind of is a cult. And I was reading a lot about like American fundamentalism and kind of cult adjacent religious communities and families when I started the process of thinking about this book. But I think for me, what it comes down to is like whether you can call their beliefs like cultish or not. Like I think like part of something like mystical or religious being real to you is that like it should be like sort of frightening. Like if you truly believe that like the bog is alive and sentient and a woman is going to come out of it, like then it would be kind of, if not totally frightening, at least intense. And I think like a lot of us in the US and in the West in general kind of have like a very like distant sense of like the supernatural, even if we are part of one religion or another. It kind of doesn't feel like a big part of our daily lives, and it doesn't feel super tangible to us. And so for me, the idea with this family is like it is so tangible to them, and it is so immediate for them. And so when going to like Michael's sort of like mainline Protestant Midwestern church, she's kind of like, I don't get this. Like, none of you are having like a terrifying transformative experience here at all. Like, it's just very different than what she grew up with.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And so what was the decision behind having Winna be the only character that experienced life outside the bog? Because at the end she chooses life on the bog. So what made you want to take her outside and then bring her back, and what was that intent?
Yeah, this was something I thought about and went back and forth about a lot too, whether when I should stay or go, and if she went, where she would she go. I always knew I wanted to have one of the siblings be kind of returning. I think that figure of like the outsider who's coming into the situation and kind of being the reader's surrogate of like, oh, this is a really messed up situation, is like a very useful character in this kind of gothic or folklore novel. But the fun thing with Wenna is that she's not totally an outsider, and even though she kind of wants to distance herself from the family, as I was writing about her character and as I was deciding what to do with her, I kind of thought more and more like she feels at home in this situation in a way that she never feels at home anywhere else. And I think ultimately like that wins out over everything else for her, like her desire for independence and her love for her husband and everything else, like it just wins out over that in the end for her.
Yeah. One of my favorite scenes in the book was the scene where she's sort of envisioning what each of the siblings could be, in a different version of reality where they had, been educated and they had gone out into the world. Do you think that her dreams of Charlie come true when Charlie heads out into the wider world? I hope so.
I hope something like that happens. Poor Charlie. I don't know if I've thought very much specifically about what his future would look like, but it is a really nice future to imagine for him that he
It
becomes
is. Yeah,
older.
Charlie, yeah, he becomes so sympathetic to me, at least throughout the novel. At first he doesn't feel all that, he didn't feel a lot sympathetic to me, at least. But as the novel goes on, you start to kind of understand the pressure. And then when you understand his relationship to the bog and the idea that everything that happens is intentional, then like that idea of fear becomes so much more prevalent. Like he legitimately believes that the bog is like setting out to cause him harm, to stop him from, his destiny. Um, yeah, so he becomes very sympathetic. So I was happy to see that he was having some amount of success, that he could send money back home, uh, but also sort of untether himself from the life that he clearly needed to not be connected to.
Yeah, I went back and forth about poor Charlie, whether he should leave or not, and what should happen with him too. And I kind of almost out of sympathy for this character I'd created, felt like I can't make him stay here. I need to let him get away, I think.
Yeah, he had too much trauma built up there. He needed a fresh take. So I want to just finish with this last question because I thought once the Bog Wife, the mother, is revealed and she starts to sort of like let them in on the fact that their attempts to quote unquote protect the bog and keep everything the same is actually the opposite of what the bog needed. I felt like it was like this amazing metaphor for the need for constant change, and both environmentally and I would say socially as well. What was your overarching goal with sort of like putting that as the button on the story?
I thought a lot about what I wanted the relationship between the family and the bog to be. And at first, it was kind of going to be straightforwardly like people living in this delicate ecosystem is bad for it and it's causing it to change, like to dry up or to get too wet or something. I was kind of like, what are the like levers we push when we are messing with this ecosystem? But the more research I did on bogs, the more I realized that really the like the greatest damage you could do to this ecosystem would be to not let it kind of evolve on its own. And so part of it was just like I really wanted to commit to kind of obviously there are some very fictional and not realistic aspects of the way this bog is presented, but commit to like what this ecosystem is like and how it's supposed to kind of transform and change. But I think it did also end up being a really useful metaphor for the way this family has been kind of preserving themselves in amber and not letting their own dynamics or their relationships with each other change at all. And that's something I know like I can struggle with in life, and I think a lot of people experience.
Yeah, I thought it was a really beautiful way to wrap up the book, and yeah, like a really beautiful point to make, because yeah, I do feel like that parallel to the family, sort of like the lack of allowed growth and sort of like, rejuvenation that can happen from growth, right? You have to like chop back the trees so they can grow fresh
Hmm.
and new, and just kind of, yeah, the parallel between the cloisteredness of the bog resonating with the closeness of the family, and sort of like the mutual destruction that happens throughout the novel. It was like, yeah, just such a great way to kind of wrap up the novel.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I also like I think writing about the bog was so much fun because um like you're saying, like there you have to kind of it has to kind of die or parts of it have to kind of die in order to move forward and to be healthy. And it is like a genuinely kind of painful process depending on your point of view in the ecosystem. And same goes for the family, of course.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I thank you so much, Kay, for joining us on Analog Adventures. We're really excited to see what you do next, and we'll definitely be following along.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Next week, we'll be talking with author Allegra Goodman about her new novel, Isola. So stay tuned for that next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye.